This video is made possible by Vincero watches, luxury handcrafted watches, but at fair prices. You can check them out at vincerowatches.com/biographics. More on them in a bit. During the 13th century, a merchant named Marco Polo returned home to Italy after spending 24 years living in the Mongolian Empire. He had the bad luck of getting arrested in Genoa while they were at war with his hometown of Venice. He was a prisoner for 2 years, and he just happened to share his cell with a famous writer named Rustichello de Pisa. The two of them shared stories with one another, as you do when you're stuck in a prison cell with absolutely no form of entertainment. Rustichello was so captivated by the stories of Marco Polo's journey that he knew that it would make a great book. So they spent those 2 years in captivity writing the manuscript together. When they were released from prison, they published the Travels of Marco Polo, and it became an overnight bestseller. Marco Polo became the first European to document so many details about the Mongolian and Chinese empires. The Western world had a difficult time believing that it was possible that there could be a civilization out there that was actually more advanced than theirs. His stories, they were so fantastic that people assumed that it was a work of fiction. For the rest of his life, Marco Polo, he was called a liar. It would take hundreds of years before the world would know that every single story he told was absolutely true. And yet, even today, there are some skeptics who find it hard to believe that one man could have seen and done so much in his lifetime. But he has still gone down in history as being one of the greatest explorers in the world. Marco Polo was born into a wealthy Venetian family in the year 1254. He was expected to follow the family trade of becoming a merchant. His father, Niccolo, and his uncle, Maffeo, were traveling most of Marco's young life. Unlike a normal job, merchants were expected to leave home for years at a time. They traveled the world and they gathered popular items like spices, pearls, gold, and gemstones that were plentiful in certain countries. They then sold these goods in other countries where they were more valuable. They would earn enough money to last for years and then again set out on a new journey. At that time, travelers would return to Europe, claiming that they had seen amazing creatures in the Far East. Many of these, they were complete works of fiction. There were stories about a country full of human-dog hybrids, fire-breathing dragons, and mystical unicorns. Christians believed that the Garden of Eden was somewhere hiding in the Middle East, and that Jerusalem was located in the exact center of the world. A lot of people either fully believed these fairy tales or chose to take everything with a grain of salt. The only people who knew the truth about what went on in foreign countries were the ones who had seen these places with their own eyes. At a time when traveling meant going on a journey that required sailing, walking, or horseback riding, people could only go so far before they ran out of money, food, and water. So the only people who really traveled the world were the merchants. They had generations of their families' maps and personal experiences behind them. It took an entire lifetime to prepare for the journey. Marco Polo grew up learning to read, write, and speak multiple languages. While his father and uncle were gone, his mother passed away, and he spent a lot of his time at home eagerly waiting for his father and uncle's return so that they could go on an adventure together. By the time Niccolo and Maffeo finally returned to Venice, Marco Polo was 15 years old. They told the boy that they had spent several years in Constantinople before finding themselves ushered into China at the heart of the Mongolian Empire. The leader, Kublai Khan, was interested in meeting them because he'd never seen European men before. The Khan was impressed by their ability to read and write in so many languages, and he believed that they could be very useful to him. The Polo brothers were treated as esteemed guests, and they were given luxuries beyond their wildest dreams. He asked them to return to Italy on a mission to meet with the Pope. Kublai Khan had requested for the Polo brothers to bring back 100 priests to the Mongolian Empire. Kublai Khan was a Buddhist, but he was very accepting of all cultures and religions. He wanted Christians to come into his empire to help diversify academic knowledge of the kingdom. Unfortunately for the Polos, they returned to find that the Vatican was arguing over who would become the next pope. Niccolo and Maffeo brought back gold and gemstones that were hidden in the lining of their clothes, and they were able to sell them for a small fortune. For 2 years, they prepared to return to Mongolia and taught Marco all about what to expect on the journey. Without the help of the Pope, they could only convince 2 priests to come with them. When Marco was 17, his father and uncle packed up the caravan and they set off on a journey across the land that would take them a full 3 years. Traveling from Italy to China was no small task. The Polos had planned to take a boat there, but they realized that after years of being away, the family ship had fallen into disrepair and there would be no way for them to sail. They had no choice but to go on foot. If they went straight through the desert, they would never make it, so they had to go on a journey where they were able to stop at small cities and oases along the way. They would have taken camels, horses, and donkeys to help carry the supplies. They ate dried meat and drank water, and once they reached a town or city, they would barter with their goods to trade for fresh fruits and vegetables in the marketplaces. All along the way, they carried goods that they could sell for a profit in the next country. The journey would have been exhausting, and they would have been exposed to brutal elements. But there were also countless numbers of bandits waiting to steal from traveling caravans. Marco Polo mentions the Tartars, who were known to kill men without mercy. But the Polo family was gifted with golden passports, which provided them protection from the Great Khan. It was written that if anyone were to mess with the Polos, they would have to face the wrath of Khan's entire army. Because of this, he never mentions going through many hardships during that journey, except for the fact that the two priests simply couldn't handle it. They were forced to turn back and return to Italy. The Polos had to cross over the Pamir Mountains in south-central Asia. He describes the bitter cold and how their fires were never as hot as they were back home. Their next big challenge was the Gobi Desert, where they periodically came across the skeletons of dead animals and humans who had not survived the harsh conditions. He often heard the singing sand dunes. He described it as sounding like different instruments playing all at once, and sometimes it sounded like the dunes were whispering his name. It was enough to drive a man mad. There were stories of men wandering into the desert to try and find the source of the music, but they never returned. Now, this story truly does sound supernatural, because it was as if some vengeful spirit was trying to lure the men into the desert. But this is actually a very real phenomenon. These musical notes come from the sound of vibrations of sand sliding down the dunes. They play the musical notes G, E, or F, which some people have described as sounding similar to a cello. Once Marco Polo reached China, he became very ill and was afraid that he might actually die. But he found mountains that were said to have magical healing powers, and he climbed the mountain, breathed in the fresh air, and found that it truly did heal him. He wrote that in Tibet, parents wanted their daughters to have sex with as many men as possible before they got married, so that they could prove how desirable they would be as wives. Since he was a young European man, these parents were practically throwing their daughters at him to have a foreigner review their daughter's sexual abilities. He mentions that Tibet was a great place to be for a boy who was 17 to 20 years old. Of course, this story caused a bit of controversy, and it was one of the many examples of the stories that people found too far-fetched to believe. But it is actually based on a real custom. Now, just before we get into the second half of today's video, let me tell you a bit about Vincero watches. I'm wearing one of these watches right now. This is a Vincero chronograph. As well as keeping perfect time, it's also got a timer and these 3 back dials here. They don't just look great, they also serve that timer function. Now, I picked out a watch from Vincero with a blue and silver combination, but there are loads of different options on their website. You're sure to find something that suits your style. And also, they'll accommodate your wrist size. I have small wrists, so they managed to get me a smaller watch, which is fantastic. It fits great on me. Now, I've put this watch through its paces, and it's still looking as good as the day I got it. Super durable, the watch itself, also the leather strap. In fact, the leather strap doesn't look new. It kind of has that nice aged leather look. It gets a little bit softer, a little bit better. I really like that. Now, Vincero watches, they believe that luxury isn't about price or specification. It's about detail and craftsmanship. And Vincero watches, they've got a ton of that. Unlike many other watches on the market, this isn't about minimalist style. You've seen those watches. This isn't that. It's more about the classic look of a good watch. Further, by selling direct to the consumer, Vincero can deliver a great watch for a much better price than you might expect. Go check out the full range at vincerowatches.com/biographics and use the code biographics on checkout for a special discount. Thanks to Vincero Watches for sponsoring, and let's get back to it. Years before Marco Polo was born, a powerful leader named Genghis Khan united the Mongolian Empire. Once all of the Mongol tribes were led by a single leader, they began to conquer surrounding territories in Asia, Eastern Europe, and the Middle East. Mongolian warriors were trained since they were toddlers to ride on horseback, and the men spent their entire lives preparing for battle. They simply had the strongest army in the world, with millions of soldiers prepared to fight for the Khan. In each new generation, the strongest heir was chosen to be the new Khan. Marco Polo and his family, they were keen to see Kublai Khan, who was arguably one of the greatest rulers the empire had ever seen. After traveling over 10,000 miles, Marco, Niccolo, and Maffeo Polo all arrived at Kublai Khan's summer palace. They were all greeted as esteemed royal guests. Even though he had heard so many stories from his father and uncle, it could never compare to experiencing the real thing. Marco Polo was completely blown away by the wealth and magnificence of the Mongolian Empire. The palace was massive and had its own park with lush gardens and exotic species of animals living on the land. Even in the 1200s, the Chinese had advanced systems of heating and cooling that had never seen in Europe. Pipes in the ground heated the polished hardwood floors, which kept the royal court warm in the winter. Engineers had constructed impressive buildings and bridges. Further, their sanitation systems were also years ahead of Europe. Everyone was clean, they smelled good, and they dressed in luxurious silk robes shimmering with golden threads. For Marco Polo, it was like he had simply died and gone to heaven. The Khan threw a celebration for the Polo family's arrival, and they had a huge feast. They fed over 40,000 guests, and Marco Polo could fill his cup with unlimited drinks from a massive silver wine fountain. He was incredibly impressed with Kublai Khan. Polo looked up to him with an almost godlike reverence because he was an example of the perfect ruler. The great Khan had incredible skill in battle like his ancestors before him, but he was also educated and level-headed when it came to making diplomatic decisions. Instead of attempting to rule every single country that he conquered, Kublai Khan allowed existing government structures to continue functioning on their own so long as they agreed to bow down to the Khan and pledge their allegiance to the Mongolian Empire. This meant that every territory was allowed to keep their religions, their languages, and their culture. Kublai Khan, he celebrated diversity, and he believed that one day the Mongolian Empire would spread across the entire planet. Because of this, it was very important to have advisors like the Polo family in his court to help him negotiate with foreign nations. Marco Polo became one of Kublai Khan's trusted advisors, and he was able to live among the royal court. Since he could speak 5 languages, he was very useful in diplomacy and negotiations. He was eventually trusted to be in charge of the Mongolian salt trade and brokered deals for sending the mineral to other lands. At that time, salt was incredibly valuable, even though it was relatively easy to produce. He described in great detail about how the workers made salt from boiling seawater in giant vats, which is a technique that is still used in China today. Along with all of these responsibilities, Marco Polo was allowed to enjoy all of the best entertainment that the empire had to offer. There were musical performances, horse races, theater, and wrestling matches. Men of high standing were allowed to have their own harem as well. The most beautiful women in the empire were all brought to the palace. He wrote about how the women were skilled in playing musical instruments and how they were all graceful and polite. Keep in mind that he was just 20 years old when he arrived, and he had already had so much experience being the most popular guy in Tibet during his journey to China. While it's not included in his book, there is one Chinese court record from that time that is believed to be about Marco Polo. A foreign man was arrested because he was walking with a woman alone at night without an escort. This was illegal, but the young man was totally unaware of the law and he had diplomatic immunity, so they simply let him go. But not all of the women in the Mongolian Empire were there for the men's entertainment. Marco Polo witnessed Kublai Khan's niece, Princess Kutayun, battle for her right to choose her own husband. She set out a challenge that if any man could defeat her in wrestling, they would win her hand in marriage. However, no one was ever able to defeat her, and she acquired a massive fleet of 10,000 horses. She was allowed to remain unmarried and fought alongside her father in battle. Even without Polo's help to keep her memory alive, Kutayun's story was so incredible that it has been passed down by word of mouth in China for hundreds of years. Scholars believe that the Polos would have been afraid of what would have happened to them after Kublai Khan's death. Since they were foreigners who were not official citizens of the empire, they may not have had the same rights and privileges once he passed away. They claimed that they were homesick and humbly requested to return to Italy. The Khan, though, he found them very useful, and at first he didn't want to see them go. But eventually he relented, saying that they could leave as long as they escorted a woman named Princess Kokachin to meet her new husband in Persia. She was also called the Blue Princess, and she was remembered for her legendary beauty. This time they did not have to go through the harsh mountains and desert. They were able to take a boat to Persia, but over 100 people, they died on the journey. Only 18 survived, including the Polos and the princess. By the time he returned to Italy, Marco Polo had been gone for 24 years and he was a bachelor in his 40s. During the war between Genoa and Venice, Marco Polo was arrested and the government illegally seized the majority of his wealth that he had acquired in his time away. He was able to hide some of his gold and gemstones, but he was truly lucky that his book was a bestseller, otherwise he may have ended up broke after all of those years away. As we mentioned before, Marco Polo told these stories to Rasputin, and yet he never describes himself or very much of his personal life. Throughout the entire book, Marco Polo is acting more like a journalist or a non-biased observer. He passes no personal judgment, and he simply explains the things that he was seeing in a very matter-of-fact way. After publishing The Travels of Marco Polo, the author got mixed reviews. Some people congratulated him for his accomplishments, while others accused him of being a liar. Many of the stories challenged Christian beliefs about the outside world, and by comparison, the Mongolian Empire seemed superior to Europe in a number of ways. They were wealthy, they were powerful, well-educated, open-minded, and had the strongest army in the world. These stories made some Europeans feel inadequate by comparison, and they clung on to their ethnocentric worldview. In modern times, scholars have pored over the original manuscript of Marco Polo's books and compared it to details of ancient Chinese documents. They were able to confirm nearly every detail being correct, which proves that he was telling the truth all along. For the rest of his life, Marco Polo tried to ignore the haters, and he went on living his life. He got married to a Venetian noblewoman, and they had 3 daughters together. In the records of his oldest daughter's dowry, it was documented that he passed on the golden passport that he received from the Khan. In 1324, Marco Polo was on his deathbed surrounded by his family. A priest showed up to read him his last rites, and he urged Polo to confess if he had truly lied about his stories as a way of cleansing his soul. His dying words were that he only told a fraction of all the stories about his amazing experiences. And if he had given away all of the stories in the book, it would blow everyone's minds, and no one would have believed him anyway. As the years went on, there would be several new editions of Marco Polo's books. Priests rewrote his stories with a Christian slant so that they could bolster Europe's superiority. They highlighted certain stories, like the women in Tibet, as examples of the East's sinfulness and depravity. They still could not stand the idea that China was just somehow better than Europe. Unfortunately, future generations would see this altered manuscript and take it as a sign that white people needed to reform foreign natives with Christianity. Future explorers like Christopher Columbus used this altered version of Marco Polo's book as a guide for his own journey. However, he often got it wrong, believing that they had landed in an entirely different country. Without the ability to speak the language, Columbus assumed that he had landed in India and immediately set out to enslave the native people. He colonized the lands for conquest and greed, rather than attempting to assimilate or understand the Native American language and culture. Now, people love the story of Marco Polo, but no one truly knows what he looked like. There are only artists' interpretations of how they imagined him. Even though he had so many stories to tell, we know very little about the actual man. We don't even really know what he did on a day-to-day basis or anything about his personality. Despite the fact that we know so little about who he truly was, he is still considered to be one of the most admired people in history, not just for his discoveries, but because he lived his life to the fullest extent. He was able to experience seeing a new world that was unlike anything that Europe had ever seen before, and he became the real-life hero of every story about that one special person who is invited to a magical world. And that, in a way, is what dreams are made of. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do give us a thumbs up below, and don't forget to subscribe. We've got brand new videos just like this several times a week. Also, if you're looking for something else to watch right now, why not check out my other channel called Today I Found Out. You'll find a link to that on the screen now, as well as below this video. And as always, thank you for watching.